Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Bruchim habayim lekulam. Welcome to this third of a series of panel presentations, 3 panel presentations that have been scheduled in honor of the release of a book that has been co-edited by me and my colleagues, Rob Kennedy of York University and Uzi Leibhun of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. This book is called Israel and the Diaspora, Jewish Connectivity in a Changing World. As you can see here, although the book itself has not yet been published, it is currently in press. It is in production. It should be published relatively soon, although we don't know exactly when we will be getting the physical copies of the book. And for some reason, I can't advance my slides, but here we go. You can see here a link to the book. It's not probably the type of book that most individuals would be buying, although it's an excellent collection of essays, but it has been priced by an academic press for library consumption. Maybe one of these days it'll come out in movie format, at which point it'll be a lot less expensive than it is now, but I will post this link in the chat function. The book itself consists of 3 major parts, 3 sub-collections of essays. The first one, which was the subject matter of the first of our 3 panels, is called Israel and the Jewish Diaspora, which dealt with the relationships between different diaspora communities and the state of Israel, so different Jewish groups in conversation with each other. The second part, the subject of our second of our 3 different panels, was called Leaving, or is called Leaving the Promised Land, which looks at Israeli diaspora communities, as it were, in different places throughout the world. And the final section, the one that is the subject matter of today's panel, is called Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism. This section consists of 5 essays specifically, and you can see them listed here in front of you: The Anti-Semitic Consequences of the BDS Movement in the US, an Indicative Incident by Carrie Nelson; Anti-Semitism, Anti-Israelism, and Canada in Context by Robert Brim and Rhonda Lenton; Jewish Students' Experiences in the Area of BDS, Exploring Jewish Lived Experience and Anti-Semitism on Canadian Campuses by Robert Kennedy; Is Anti-Israelism, Anti-Semitism, Evidence from the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, Survey of Attitudes Towards Jews Among the Population of Great Britain by Jonathan Boyd; and The BDS Movement in Australia, a Case Study by Philip Mendes. Unfortunately, not all of the authors of these 5 articles were able to be with us today. Being on sabbatical and being relatively oblivious to such matters, when we scheduled this panel, I was completely unaware that we are now, or would be, in the middle of a Canadian long weekend, not to mention the fact that it's the beginning of what we call Reading Week at York University, or spring break as it is colloquially known by our students. So that has kept a couple of the authors away from the discussion today. Also, the fact that it happens to be about 3 a.m. in Australia has kept another one of our authors away from our discussion. But we are very happy to have 3 of our authors here with us today: Jonathan Boyd of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, Carrie Nelson of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Robert Kennedy of York University. And the whole discussion will be moderated by yours truly, Carl Ehrlich of York University. As you can tell from the poster here, today's topic, anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, is arguably the most controversial of the topics that we deal with in this volume. There are many questions that arise through this juxtaposition of the terms anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Are they one and the same? Do they overlap? Are they completely different phenomena? These are some of the questions that we will be looking at and examining over the course of the next close to 2 hours. The structure of our session today is relatively self-evident. After my introduction, which I hope will not take more than 10 minutes. If it does, I will lose my tenure at York University. We will have 3 10-minute plus or minus presentations by our contributors, Jonathan Boyd, Carrie Nelson, and Rob Kennedy. This will be followed by about half an hour for a discussion among the contributors, which will be moderated by yours truly. And finally, about 50 minutes to an hour, depending on interest, but no later than 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be taking questions from the audience. If you would like to pose a question, please use the Q&A function, which I believe you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screens. And I will be then going through the questions and posing questions to our speakers. So please avail yourselves of the opportunity to pose questions at any time during the course of the presentations, and they will be monitored, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Finally, before turning over the podium to Jonathan Boyd and the other 2 speakers, I would like to say a few words of thanks for supporting and enabling today's program. First of all, to the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University, Kalman Weiser, the acting director, and Julie Feinberg-Telesnik, the coordinator. York University's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, who have supported financially all 3 of these panel presentations. B'nai B'rith Canada and its CEO, Michael Mostyn, who also have supported these panels. The Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry, of which Judith Boxer-Lieberand is the president. And last but certainly not least, the University Information Technology Unit at York University and our most able technicians, Bert Ime and Grant McNair, who are ensuring that everything runs smoothly today. So without any further ado, I would like to turn the podium over to Jonathan Boyd.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. All I can see is my PowerPoint on my screen, so I hope everything's working fine. Oh, hold on. Okay. Can people see me? I hope so. Thank you, Carl. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Rob, for the invitation to come and speak today. I really appreciate it. I wish I could be with you in Toronto. Sadly, that's not possible right now. I am here in cold, windy London, but delighted to be able to participate in this conversation with you anyway. I want to share the results of a piece of work that I actually originally presented in the conference that took place in Toronto. That was the sort of the preparation for the book, and the research really came out of a sense of frustration about this conversation about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, in the sense that so much of the conversation is claim and counterclaim and counterclaim and counterclaim. It becomes almost like a sort of a pantomime type conversation. Oh yes it is, oh no it's not, oh yes it is, etc. And we wanted to, at my institute, we wanted to do some work which tested empirically whether anti-Jewish ideas and anti-Israel ideas are indeed related or not, as the case may be. And I deliberately, by the way, use the term anti-Jewish and anti-Israel as opposed to anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. Perhaps we can get into that in the conversation, but I deliberately use them. And the piece of work essentially involved a fairly sort of straightforward exercise, really. We took a series of statements. On the left, you can see the anti-Jewish statements. On the right, you can see anti-Israel statements. These are sort of commonly used in the study of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, particularly by the Anti-Defamation League, but also by others, where you invite a sample of people. In this case, it's the population of Great Britain, to ask them whether. Oh, sorry, you can't see my PowerPoint. Oh, okay, hold on. Let me try and do this again. Okay, can you see it now? I hope so. So I'll go back briefly. You can see on the left a set of anti-Jewish statements, a set of anti-Israel statements on the right. As I said, the statements on the left particularly are used commonly in studies of anti-Semitism. The comments on the right used quite commonly in studies of anti-Israel attitudes. But we weren't aware of a study that had really looked at these two things together. And essentially what we wanted to do was invite a sample of people, in this case, as I said, the population of Great Britain, present them with these different statements and ask them whether they agreed with them strongly, whether they tended to agree, tended to disagree, strongly disagreed, weren't sure, etc. And as I said, series of statements on the left were about Jews, series of statements on the right are about Israel. We very deliberately separated these two statements out in the course of the survey so that people wouldn't get confused between one and another. You can see all the statements there. The numbers or the percentages after each statement are the proportion of people in Great Britain who, the first number is the proportion who agreed strongly with the statement. The second number in each case is those that tended to agree with that statement. And we tested them out, and we looked at, what proportions of people in Great Britain agree with these statements or disagree. I can go into that in much more detail, but in a sense, it's not terribly important for this particular conversation, because the next step of the research was to look at, if I can move the slide forward. Yeah, there we go. Was to look at the numbers of people or the proportions of people who agreed perhaps with none of the statements in terms of anti-Jewish or anti-Israel attitudes, or one of them while disagreeing with all the others, or two while disagreeing with the others, or three or four, or et cetera, et cetera. And you can see on the left the proportion of people who agreed with different numbers of statements in terms of the anti-Jewish ones, and on the right in terms of the anti-Israel ones. Again, we're looking at these two things completely separately at this point. One of the things just to note, and this is the case in Great Britain, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't the case elsewhere. Certainly wouldn't be the case I'd be surprised if it wasn't the case in Canada. The proportions of people who didn't agree with any of the anti-Jewish statements was much higher than the proportion of people who didn't agree with the anti-Israel statements. So there's a clear distinction. You can see on the left, 70% of people agree with any of the anti-Jewish statements we tested, and 30% agreed with at least one, and most of those people disagreed with the majority of those. When we look at anti-Israel statements, you can see that 44% agreed with none of them, 56%, therefore 56%, that should say in the middle of the circle, agreed with at least one. So you can see that anti-Israel attitudes are clearly more common, certainly in British society, than anti-Jewish attitudes. But as I said, up to now, we're looking at these two things completely separately. The question we were interested in exploring, having done that, was to what extent these two things correlate, i.e., if you hold anti-Israel attitudes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, etc., do you also hold anti-Jewish attitudes, and vice versa? That would be a way of empirically testing whether these two things correlate in some way. So here are the results, kind of conveyed as in a lot of numbers, and it's a slightly complicated slide to to explain. But in brief, if you look across the top, we created what we call the anti-Israel index. And you can see there the numbers 0 to 9 there. So 0 means that column of the people who didn't agree with any of the anti-Israel statements we presented, and then moving over along to the right, eventually you get to the people in column 9 who agreed with all 9 of the anti-Israel statements. We're then cross-referencing that you can see down the left-hand side, the anti-Jewish index. So there, we're measuring the two things against one another. So just to explain an example, if you look at the orange column on the left, these are people who didn't agree with any anti-Israel statements. And the 86% of them also didn't agree with any anti-Jewish statements. 11% of them agreed with just one anti-Jewish statements, but the vast majority of those who scored 0 on the anti-Israel index, i.e. didn't agree with any of those statements, also didn't agree with any of the anti-Jewish statements. If you go over to the right-hand side of the column, here we're looking at people who agreed with all 9 anti-Israel statements, and you can see that the picture here is very different. Only 21% of them didn't agree with any anti-Jewish statements. And if you kind of look towards the bottom of that column, the proportions who agreed with at least 4 anti-Jewish statements, or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, then you see that about half of that group agreed with 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 anti-Jewish statements. So there does appear to be, on the basis of this, a clear sort of correlation, and perhaps a simpler way of showing this is in this slide, and this will be the last slide that I will share. This is kind of another way of looking at it. If you look at the chart on the left, this is for the population of Great Britain as a whole. As you'll recall from an earlier slide, 30% of people in Great Britain agreed with at least one of those anti-Jewish statements. If we then go down to the next point, you can see the 0. So 14% of people so of those who didn't agree with any anti-Israel statements, only 14% of them agreed with at least one anti-Jewish statement. Of those who agreed with 1 to 3 anti-Israel statements, we then have a third of them agreeing with at least one anti-Jewish statement. Of those who agreed with 4 to 6 anti-Israel statements, we're now on 58%. Who scored at least 1 or more on the anti-Jewish index. And of those who agreed with 7 to 9 statements, i.e. agreed with pretty well every anti-Israel idea that we presented to them, close to 3/4 of them scored at least 1 or more on the anti-Jewish index, i.e. agreed with at least 1, if not more, anti-Jewish statements. So that pattern basically demonstrates the correlation. The more one holds anti-Israel attitudes, or the more anti-Israel attitudes one holds, the more likely one is also to agree with anti-Jewish ideas. And looking at the right-hand side of the slide, we also tested this not just at a national population level, but among different subgroups in Great Britain. So the top chart is people who identified in Great Britain as far left on the political spectrum. We had created a spectrum of left to right. These are people who all said they were on the far left of the political spectrum. Interestingly, a very similar proportion of them to the population on average, 33%, agreed with one Jewish statement or more. But the important thing is the pattern. Again, we see the more people hold anti-Israel statements, or the more anti-Israel statements people agreed with, the more likely they were also to hold anti-Jewish ideas. We found the same thing when we looked at those people who self-identified as the far right. That's the second chart on the right-hand side. The anti-Jewish attitudes were more prevalent among the far right than the far left, but nevertheless, the pattern is the same. And we also looked at the Muslim population, the self-identified Muslim population of Great Britain. And again, we see the same pattern. The more people agree with anti-Israel statements, the more likely they are also to agree with anti-Jewish statements. Now, the one caveat that I think is important in the context of this conversation, if you again look at the chart on the left, you can see and look at the bottom bar. So here we're looking at people who agreed with 7 to 9 of the anti-Israel statements we presented to them. It's interesting that 74% of them scored one or more on the anti-Jewish index, i.e. agreed with at least one anti-Jewish idea at the same time. But that also means there's 26%, the remaining 26%, who agreed with pretty well every anti-Israel idea we presented to them, but didn't agree with a single anti-Jewish idea, which is, I think, a sort of an important piece of the work, because it means that it is indeed possible to hold virulently anti-Israel ideas, whilst at the same time not appearing, at the very least, to hold anti-Jewish ideas. Now, some might say that some of the anti-Israel ideas that we presented are in and of themselves anti-Semitic, and that's certainly something we can talk about. But it does seem to be entirely possible on the basis of this work to hold very, very strong anti-Israel views, but at the same time not hold any anti-Jewish sentiment, any specifically anti-Jewish sentiment at all. I'll leave it at that. There's plenty more to talk about, but hopefully that kind of gets across the key idea from the study.
Thank you very much, Dr. Boyd. I would now like to call on Carrie Nelson.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk with people. So in examining the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, it may clarify the issues at stake to begin with a fact, and it is a fact, that Israel is part of the personal identity of millions of Jews worldwide. That's true even for severe Jewish critics of the Jewish state. And I think it's true for Jews who explicitly reject the idea that Israel is embedded within themselves. They say it isn't. Nonetheless, I think it is. Because of that, the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is both intellectual or political and personal for Jews. I was born and raised as a Jew in the United States and continue to live here. But there's a sense in which I experience the Israeli government as acting in my name when it enacts policies, especially those that I agree or disagree with. I'm not an Israeli citizen. I don't see myself that way. And I certainly don't consider myself politically responsible for Israeli government policies to which I object, any more than I do for US government policies, at least when I object to them. But I am anguished when either government acts badly. That's a matter of multiple identities. I'm more than one thing at the same time, not of dual loyalties. Holding Jews worldwide to be politically responsible for Israeli policies is indeed anti-Semitic, as one of the IHRA definitions examples points out. I accept an emotional and intellectual tie with Israel as a matter of choice. And I make no demands of other Jews about how to handle their relationship to the Jewish state. People can choose denial as their mode of relationship, but for Jews, denial is a mode of relationship nonetheless. As an assault on a portion of a Jew's core identity, anti-Zionism surely counts as a form of anti-Semitism. If it's experienced that way by hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps by millions, it's a verifiable social phenomenon. It cannot be wished away by saying that that shouldn't be the case. The IR-DEF specification of an anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism connection being based on criticism of Israel not comparable to those applied to other nations cements the connection and disqualifies claims of anti-Semitism based on criticism that's typical of international critique and debate. The IRA makes that clear, and most rational people agree with it. So far, that's really an experiential explanation of a relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But the objective conditions of the relationship are equally important. Anti-Zionism often constitutes a judgment that the Jewish state is hopelessly compromised, indeed compromised in its fundamental moral and political character, and that it was so since 1948, and thus that the Jewish state literally cannot be reformed. If you argue that it cannot be reformed and still remain a Jewish state, I think that also qualifies as simultaneously anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. So on that logic, some entity can remain in the place of Israel, but not one designated as a Jewish state. This is an eliminationist agenda, and it's at the core of both many anti-Zionist claims and anti-Zionist actions. Thus, the BDS, and of course now Amnesty International, demand that Israel offer a right of return to millions of descendants of Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war, and that could easily turn Jews in Israel into a minority population and make an explicitly Jewish state impossible. As an external imposition on Israel, it deprives both Jewish and non-Jewish citizens of the right of political self-determination. Imposed uniquely on Israel, it crosses a line into anti-Semitism. The so-called one-state solution would add 2 million West Bank Palestinians to Israel's, along with still more returning Palestinians, and have the same effect. Whether explicitly or implicitly, calling for the end of the Jewish state constitutes anti-Semitism. Scores and scores of lesser forms of anti-Zionism also cross the line into anti-Semitism. Thus, when a University of Michigan faculty member told one of his students he would write a letter of recommendation for her to study at any university outside Israel, any university in the world, but not for Tel Aviv University, which is where she wanted to study, he was uniquely boycotting an Israeli institution and engaging in anti-Semitism, both in a macro-political sense. Indeed, a number of faculty members at other institutions pledged to join him and deny recommendations to study in Israel, and turned it into a political campaign, and in a micro-political anti-Semitic treatment of that particular student. And that's the example that I start my essay in the book with. Micro-political, local anti-Semitic actions often form national or international trends. One of the continuing examples are the local efforts to prevent invited Israeli or Zionist lecturers from speaking on campus. Now, I actually believe that academic freedom permits vocal demonstrations before an invited lecture begins, as well as a brief interruption during a presentation. But repeated interruptions or efforts to block a presentation from proceeding constitute violations of academic freedom. Such aggressions against Zionist speakers are once again fundamentally anti-Semitic. Part of what collective anti-Zionism does is turn such violations of academic freedom into high moral principles that trump lesser values, and that is increasingly the case. Worst of all, micro anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic actions are the merciless campaigns waged against individual students and faculty. A number of these campaigns have been documented in the press or in books about campus anti-Semitism. Some, like the campaign waged against philosophy professor Andrew Pessin at Connecticut College, were triggered by malicious characterizations of blog posts or other faculty statements. But, and this is remarkable but proven, completely fabricated allegations have also been a regular feature of anti-Semitic campaigns. People accuse a student or a faculty member of something they haven't done at all, that has no relationship to the truth, and then other students and faculty pile on to and intensify such assaults. And even faculty unions have joined into those assaults when the accusation is completely invented. Now, fabricated allegations have on a number of occasions been disproven, but often only after months of exhausting and humiliating investigation accompanied by public calumny. Moreover, there's no pattern, and this is important, there's no pattern of any originator of a fabricated accusation being sanctioned. The pattern is you can tell a lie, you can promote a lie, you made it up, you know it's a lie, and no one holds you responsible. After Rose Rich, a vice president in the University of Southern California student government, was pilloried for no reason other than her Zionism, all the university president could manage was a mild statement of regret. Concerned students and faculty must begin to agitate for meaningful disciplinary procedures. That's the first of several recommendations for change I'm going to make. Now, anti-Zionist faculty publications are also rife with false accusations that clearly merit identification as anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, several major university presses have established anti-Zionist publication practices that include manuscript reviews that do not require authors to document or prove anti-Zionist accusations. Duke University Press and the University of California Press are among the prime examples. Supposedly prestigious academic journals, such as Critical Inquiry from the University of Chicago Press, follow the same corrupt practice. You can make an anti-Zionist accusation. You don't have to prove it. California will publish it, Duke will publish it, Chicago will publish it. When Duke University Press published Jasper Puar's book, The Right to Maim, in 2017, which was full of unsupported anti-Semitic accusations about Israeli policy, the publisher responded by defending her academic freedom. She has the right to make these claims, but a publisher has a responsibility to fact-check allegations of fact. Among Puar's false claims was that Israel was deliberately stunting the growth of Palestinian children by denying them access to food. Every responsible international medical authority, from the WHO to the UN, and also the Palestinian Authority, was already in print, documenting that childhood stunting was not a serious problem either in Gaza or the West Bank. In fact, Puar is unable to cite a single medical publication or authority in support of her claim. No matter, the National Women's Studies Association gave the book their annual award, and Puar was promoted to full professor at Rutgers University. Once a publisher establishes a stable of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist authors and reviewers, they will have a thoroughly consistent peer reviewing system that will spare both authors and the press itself from responsible professional evaluation and challenges. It's a closed anti-Zionist publishing system. Faculty members and administrators need to demand responsible fact-checking and responsible copy editing. Suggestion for change number 2. When faculty members assign and endorse Jasper Puar's publications in their courses, they are engaged in anti-Semitism, not just anti-Zionism. Books like Puar's fuel, facilitate, and provide cover for anti-Semitic classroom indoctrination. Academic freedom makes it impossible to sanction such teaching. I believe that's true, unfortunately, but faculty members can be assigned different courses. If they're indoctrinating students, you assign them to teach something else. It's an administrative responsibility, moreover, to make sure that courses with different perspectives are included in the campus curriculum. Somewhere on campus, you have to be able to take courses that are not anti-Semitic courses. Now, some academic disciplines and departments just can't be reformed. They are ideologically committed to anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's equally useless to demand that Puar and her allies offer balanced courses. They're fanatics, the anti-Zionist equivalent of QAnon advocates. So you have to combat this by offering different courses elsewhere in the curriculum. I think the last thing to say is that there are strategies for handling all of the anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist trends I have listed. All it requires is the courage to do so. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Nelson. I would now like to call on our third panelist today, Rob Kennedy.
Thank you, Dr. Ehrlich. Thank you, colleagues, Jonathan and Carrie. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Sorry. And there we go. So I have to thank my colleagues for bringing up many points that I think are relevant and that I have to deal with within my own research, looking at 60 students from Canadian universities ranging from Quebec, Ontario to Manitoba. And what I did between 2016 and 18 is interview them, and we talked about campus safety issues. And really, things that did come up were, criticism of Israel, as you can see, are they, really anti-Semitic or are they not? My colleagues covered some of these issues, but I'm going to be drilling down a bit into the data that I found from the interviews. Now, just as markers in terms of looking at anti-Semitism on campuses, there's been issues where Jewish students in the past have been excluded. There's been past cases where, during the 20s and 30s, Nazis were invited onto specific campuses, as Norwood points out, specifically Columbia and some of the southern universities. And then what Wistrich talks about, is there a new anti-Semitism? And I'm not going to go into too many details. My colleagues covered some of them, but looking at working definitions, I think are helpful, and I'll touch on that again. In other words, the IHRA working definition. It's not perfect, but it is a working definition. And then, of course, the revised Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. Again, I see them, both the last two, as working definitions that are helpful and could be good guides in terms of anti-Semitism. The great thing about the interviews were the students, of course, and really they talked very openly about what they had to deal with in terms of not always revealing their identity. Some did, some didn't, and some feared the retribution in terms of not only other students, but obviously faculty members, and of course, regarding their grades. They talked about administrators either listening to them carefully and helping, or others ignoring them and minimizing. And then, many of them that I talked to, about 40 of the 60 were courageous, and when I use that term, I use it carefully in terms of tabling, in terms of discussing Jewish issues. None of them wanted to shut down any kind of discussion. In fact, they were advocating in many cases freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and discussing anti-Semitism openly. And I think this was, one of those moments where I see that this is where university students are at least at that time. So it was very clear that they wanted to discuss BDS, Israel, and anti-Semitism. But many of them did see BDS as a fig leaf for anti-Semitism, as they always talked about it targeting Israel based on ideology, not fact, and then conveniently leaving out other countries that had abysmal human rights records, and really wanted to make it very clear that some publications needed to be, like Amnesty International, needed to be challenged because of the focus, on Israel, it seems at times, and sometimes not focusing enough on other countries in the same way, qualitatively and quantitatively. So it was interesting that they really did have to be so careful in classroom conversations with fellow students. And of course, they always talked about faculty members. And it was first-year students that were trying to deal with matriculation issues and transitions that did not want to discuss these issues. They're very hard to interview. And you can understand why. And it was the upper year students that were more seasoned and acclimatized that did. But, you know, the key part is understanding, how do we move forward? We know the problems, we know the issues, we know, as Jonathan pointed out, the idea that there may be points where it's just anti-Israel sentiment. There may be points where it's clearly anti-Semitism, and then what Wistrich calls the new anti-Semitism. And saying these things, we're talking about when it really is an attack more on Israel based on fictions and ideology and not facts. And I think the way forward is, you know, as Stern points out in his 2020 book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, really pushing students who already are critical thinkers and really wanting to have a safe space for open dialogue and making sure that students are taken care of. And in many ways, especially in the classroom, this is the responsibility of professors. This is the responsibility of administrators. And the students did talk about very good and responsive professors and administrators, but others they feared in terms of their ideological bents and the fact of, you know, administrators minimizing these things. But it was the idea of wanting to make sure that they could move forward, that there could be clear, open discussion. But also, some of them did talk about definitions of anti-Semitism and moving forward, making sure that there is an agreed upon definition of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate-based discrimination based on critical thinking and these learning moments, whichever one, you know, seems to make sense as a working definition that should be updated. And I would argue that if any definition is used in terms of discrimination or hate and defining it very clearly, it should be updated. It should promote free speech. And, you know, the students were always talking, you know, in terms of wanting to discuss these matters. And this was the heartening moment where these students were saying, you know, we do need to discuss them. And as Stern argues in his book, again, The Conflict Over the Conflict, you need to prepare students for outside what is happening. We see the protests in Ottawa and other places. Racism is not exclusive to campuses. We know it's everywhere else. So again, having these open dialogues in safe spaces where there are responsible faculty members, where there are administrators that are sensitive to these issues, are extremely important. So the way forward is a challenging one because of the rancor that happens, especially over Israel, but it should be based on, in many ways, as Stern points out, facts, not fictions, not ideologies, but making sure that if there is a criticism of Israel, it's a clear one based on empirically derived facts that are traceable to the source. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Kennedy. Rob, I'd like to invite our three panelists, Rob, Carrie, and Jonathan, yes, you are all here online. And allow me first to see whether any of you have any questions for your colleagues or comments about what has been presented. But before you do jump in, I do want to remind our listeners, our participants today, that you may pose questions and comments using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. A number of you have already done so. We welcome more, and we will be getting to your questions and comments after this lightning round of of discussion amongst ourselves. So any of you three want to take a crack at commenting on someone else's presentation, or thought of a little footnote to your presentation that you still want to sneak in there while you can?
I'll add a little footnote because I can see some of the questions, if that's okay. I was conscious that I only had 10 minutes, so I sort of jumped straight into findings before without doing anything on methodology, and there are a few questions about that. So I just, if I could have a minute or so just to explain that might be helpful. Just very briefly, the study is the largest study that I think has ever been done of this topic, certainly in Great Britain, and to the best of my knowledge, actually anywhere in the world. Sample size was 5,500 people. It was 4,000 people nationally, and then we boosted the sample to pick up a sufficient number of people on the far left and far right and the Muslim population to ensure that we had large enough samples to be able to analyze. The results are all statistically significant. There's actually, in the report, which is available on the JPR website, there's a 15-page methodology. We went into a lot of detail in the report because we were conscious that it's quite a complicated and potentially quite controversial study. So there's a detailed methodology there. There's also a second report that we published, which I think is quite interesting, which looks specifically at the boycott contention and the apartheid contention specifically, and the correlation between those statements and anti-Jewish ideas. And actually all the correlation coefficients are listed in that study for those people who are interested in that kind of stuff. I don't quite know who's here and how many people are interested in statistical methods and how many people are more interested in just trying to understand the topic. But if you're interested in correlation coefficients, there is a paper also on our website which draws on the same data. As I said, looks at the boycott and the apartheid contention specifically, and lists all the correlation coefficients. And one of the things I think that's interesting about it is that certain anti-Israel statements are more likely to correlate with anti-Jewish sentiment than others. The one that correlated most strongly was Israel exploits Holocaust victim for its own purposes. Interestingly, one of the ones that correlated least well was the contention that Israel is an apartheid state. But there are distinctions there to be drawn, certainly in that data set. It's only one study, so it's I think it needs to be done in other countries. It needs to be done again in Britain in order to test the results. But all of that more detailed information is in both the main report, which was published in 2017, and a follow-up report, as I said, which was published, I think, a year later or so.
Okay, thank you very much. Carrie or Rob, would you like to jump in at this point with any comments, questions? I'm happy to
address things that have come up in the Q&A, but I'm happy to wait till then.
Well, let me ask a question then, simply because this is something that has come up in all of your presentations, and that's the question of definitions. And we're dealing with certain very loaded concepts here, very loaded terms: anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism, of course, begs the question, what is Zionism? And that is a whole other discussion that may be of interest. But certainly referenced already is the so-called IHRA definition, or working definition, of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's working definition of anti-Semitism, that has become the, if you will, the most widely used standard in the last few years for defining anti-Semitism, although its definition has been under some attack in some quarters, including within the context of the Jewish community, where at least I'm aware of at least two competing definitions of what anti-Semitism is. One, the so-called Jerusalem Declaration. There was another one, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but also within the Canadian context, a couple of months ago, a group of 100 or 200 professors at Canadian universities got together to reject the IHRA definition without, however, offering anything in its place. And indeed, questioning also whether BDS, another term that has come up today, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel, is anti-Semitic as those who follow the IHRA definition would claim. So there are a lot of things that I've just thrown into the hopper. So I'm wondering if any of you would like to jump in on any of these different points to try to elucidate the issues a bit for us.
Well, I can say something about it. I'm one of the people who finds the IHRA definition very useful, although there's a bit of a confusion in what the IHRA definition actually refers to. It includes a very brief attempt to define anti-Semitism, and I think there is no such thing as a good brief definition of anti-Semitism. It can't be done. I mean, the medieval belief that Jews were poisoning the wells of Europe is not exactly the same as the claim, the unsupported claim as well, that Israel is committing genocide. I mean, anti-Semitism has changed and adapted in the course of 2,000 years, and a brief definition is never going to do. However, the key part of the IHRA definition are the 11 examples that follow. And I think that those are very useful in categorizing and recognizing contemporary examples of anti-Semitism. They won't help you with anti-Semitism 500 years ago, but they help you look at the contemporary world and decide what might be anti-Semitic. But IHRA also says you have to look at the context, you have to evaluate what other things people have said, you have, but they are signposts. They are warnings that examples may be anti-Semitic. And I find them very useful that way in dealing with debates and dealing on campus and educational contexts. And IHRA also makes it very clear that they're not meant to be a disciplinary mechanism. That is, they're not meant to be a way of punishing people. For one thing, as soon as you require a lot of analysis in context, you can't get to punishment so easily. So they're not really designed for that. They're designed to help you understand the phenomenon. There's one broad definition, one broad context for recognizing forms of anti-Semitism. There's a book that came out last year by Bernard Harrison called Blaming the Jews, which is particularly good on this. And he distinguishes between anti-Semitism as a social prejudice, you don't like Jewish people, versus anti-Semitism as a political theory, a theory that explains the world. And I think that's a basic division in defining anti-Semitism that's very clarifying.
Okay, thank you. Rob or Jonathan?
Yeah, I wouldn't mind jumping in. I mean, I brought them up on my slides, and I think as pedagogical tools, working definitions are a great idea. I mean, the late Robert Wistrich took about 1,000 pages to try to do this in really what could be seen as a magnum opus, and dying shortly after that. And there's more work to be done. Even with the Jerusalem Declaration, again, I appreciate the hard work to try to come up with a way of continuously augmenting definitions, but it's good to have the guideposts. And I think not only with universities having them and students understanding them as pedagogical tools, and I agree with Perry, with Carrie completely in terms of understanding these not as punishments and not as tools of pointing out issues in terms of finding fault, but really helping students out. But not only, I would extend this beyond universities, even at school boards, having proper definitions that are up to date and not antiquated, but ones that are using the latest literature in terms of how this can be navigated. And I would extend this to all forms of hate, that you do need to consider in conjunction to anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. You do need to consider issues around anti-Black racism and other types of hate. And I think definitions are helpful, as I said, as pedagogical tools.
I'll step in on it because I do think it's at the core of the conversation. The first thing I would say is that I think it's almost impossible to define any sort of hate, like moving away from anti-Semitism, to have a simple, clear, agreed definition of what constitutes a hate statement is, I think, an impossible task. So I think IRA, the IRA definition, is unquestionably imperfect because I don't think perfection is possible. But I think it's important to bear in mind where it came from and why it was created in the first place. So it goes back to 2006. It was set up by, the statement was originally put together by the EUMC, a European Union Monitoring Centre. It's now been renamed the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And the purpose of it was to give law enforcement some sort of way of trying to understand if somebody comes forward and says, I think I've been a victim of anti-Semitism, they've got some sort of document to refer to try to determine whether it is or isn't. So it's not a legal definition, it's a working definition, it's an advisory definition. It's kind of, I see it as a, the document that you have in the top drawer of your desk that you kind of pull out when something happens to, just to try to, for law enforcement to ascertain. As I said, it came out in 2006 originally, and the IRA definition is very similar to the original definition that the EUMC established. But one of the things that really sort of struck me at the time, and that I've gone back to several times since, is that the year before the EUMC definition was established, 2005 was the year that I don't know if people remember this, but the year that Ilan Halimi, a young French Jew, was murdered, tortured and murdered over a horrendous story over a 3-year period, three-week period. And one of the things that was really striking about that incident was, pretty well from day one, the family realized and the Jewish community realized, because of all sorts of indicators that had happened, that this was an anti-Semitic incident. And yet the French police consistently over, weeks, while Ilan Halimi was still alive, while the case was ongoing, refused to accept that this was anti-Semitism. They thought it was avarice. They thought it was, motivated by money. The end of the story, we know, he was brutally tortured and murdered, and it was abundantly clear in the trial that the perpetrators were, blatantly anti-Semitic, no question about it. So it's really, really important from a law enforcement point of view to have a definition that can be used so that, so that police, so law enforcement services can recognize anti-Semitism when they see it. We as people involved in the Jewish world, as Jews, kind of like intuitively understand anti-Semitism when you see it. You kind of, you can tell almost in every case. You can't assume the same about law enforcement authorities, and therefore the importance of having a definition for that purpose is really, really critical. And the IRA definition, as I said, it's imperfect because I don't think there is a perfect definition, but as an advisory definition, it is incredibly helpful, and Carrie's absolutely right. It is advisory. It's very clear that it says it always depends on the context. Any statement might be anti-Semitic, or it might not. You have to bear in mind the context. And I think we found that in our research. It's possible to hold like vehemently anti-Israel positions and yet not be anti-Jewish in any way, shape, or form. But at the same time, it's more likely than not, and that's an important thing to bear in mind. And I think Ira captures that actually quite well.
Just to add one small thing in support of what Jonathan said, if you simply look at the diverse phenomenon of contemporary anti-Semitism, you really can't make much sense of it unless you have some categories, unless you have a series of types of major forms of contemporary anti-Semitism. And that's why it's been useful to law enforcement. And that's why there are 11 examples there that at least lets you begin figuring out what slots statements belong in.
Yeah, playing devil's advocate here for a moment, I know that much of the criticism of the IRA definition deals specifically with these 11 examples, and specifically with the 6 of the 11 examples that deal with Israel. And as one of the people pointed out in the chat, there is now a competing group, if you will, or an alternate group here in Canada of Jewish professors called the Jewish Faculty Network that rejects those aspects of the IRA definition that touch on the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So these 6 examples that deal specifically with defining certain anti-Israel activities as being anti-Semitic. So I'm wondering if any of you wish to address that issue here. Those are the controversial clauses of the IRA definition. The other 5 are not that controversial.
I mean, my own view, again, this is an advisory document. So, I think what IRA is trying to say is that anti-Semitism can come in the form of anti-Israelism. It doesn't always. One has to bear in mind the context, but it can, right? So a statement that, Israel is an apartheid state or one should boycott Israel may or may not be anti-Semitic, depending on the context in which it's said, the manner in which it's said, the realities of the particular situation. And it seems to me that that's right. It's possible. Like even if you really struggle with that idea, even if you struggle with the idea that there's any relationship at all between anti-Israel sentiment and anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic sentiment, I think it's very difficult to argue that an anti-Israel statement directed, for example, kind of violently against a group of Jewish students on campus, or Jews walking along the street on the way to synagogue in Toronto or in London or wherever it is, does not have some sort of anti-Semitic feel to it, and at the very least might be experienced as anti-Semitic. So I personally don't think there's anything particularly contentious about it. I think it's difficult to argue that the anti-Israel sentiment cannot be used in certain circumstances and isn't used in certain circumstances as a weapon against Jews who are minding their own business, getting on with their lives. And I think when that happens, it's at the very least experienced by Jews as anti-Semitic, and can be very unpleasant. At the same time, I think within the Jewish world, I think we have to be conscious that the offensive statement is not necessarily a racist statement. The right to offend, I think, is entirely legitimate. But there's a grey line there, and it's very sometimes it's really, really difficult to define. So again, there's an advisory statement that is there, I think, to help those people who are in positions of authority to judge, to make a call in each instance. And I think that's what IRA's for.
Is there a need for competing statements then?
Personally, I don't think so, and I think a lot of the discussion about competing statements has been somewhat politically motivated. The reality, I think, on the ground, I don't work in a university. I work in an independent institute where we do a lot of when we do a lot of empirical research, but we also do a lot of policy related work. And I know that in the political world, certainly in Britain and across Europe, the more academic definitions have made no headway whatsoever in terms of what is being utilized to think about and to explore and to measure the nature of anti-Semitism. The IRA definition is very much kind of assumed and accepted as the key working definition. Some people like it more or less, but that is very much the definition that is being used, certainly in sort of political circles.
Well, I think the IRA definition of when it's focusing on those 6 specific Israel-related examples tries to offer some pretty clear bases of distinctions. So a criticism of Israeli government policy, which is comparable to the way government policies in other countries are based, is not anti-Semitic. So that pretty much does away with the complaint that IRA makes all criticism of Israel government policies anti-Semitic. That's nonsense. It's very clear. I'm in print criticizing a number of Israeli government policies, and I don't accuse myself of being anti-Semitic. And, as far as I know, no one else accuses me of that. You can't spend any time in Israel at all where there's more political debate. I consider that if I spend a month in Israel, I deal with more political debates than I do in a year in the United States. You can't spend 15 minutes in Israel without encountering Israelis who are highly critical of their government policies. So that kind of process goes on all the time, nonstop. And IRA is pretty clear. If you're complaining about something that would also be the basis of a complaint about another government, it ain't anti-Semitic. But if you single out Israel for demands or complaints that are unique to Israel and you ignore the rest of the world, and you make Israel the worst violator of human rights in the galaxy, that just might be an anti-Semitic impulse. So I think that IRA is actually very helpful in those six specific examples. Now, the Jerusalem definition and the Nexus definition have wanted to create more space for anti-Zionist arguments. And so that's really been the focus of those alternative definitions, to expand the acceptable space of anti-Zionist argument. I don't happen to think they succeed, but in a way it's sort of irrelevant whether they're needed or not, because they're going to happen, right? It's going to be a subject of debate. And so you're going to get this stuff, and it's more basis to sort of think through these issues and hopefully clarify them further.
I mean, IRA does give us the guideposts, and to be continued in terms of augmentation. It generally, especially on campus, we have to accept the fact that freedom of speech is something we can't let go of, and even to the point of understanding hate speech, because you're always preparing students for what's going to be off campus. We can't start quelling things, so we have these guideposts, and IRA provides a very good guidepost. The Jerusalem Declaration augments it. Criticism of Israel is something that we're all used to, and within Israel, I mean, all we have to do is watch Israeli cinema, and it's very clear whether it's coming from the left or right. There are implicit or explicit criticisms of the country. But this is something we need to welcome, and IRA will give us that guidepost for the time being of saying, okay, you crossed the line. But it's not cutting off criticism of Israel generally based on facts, not fictions or ideology, and it's opening things up for us in terms of understanding when the line has been crossed in terms of what Wistrich calls the new anti-Semitism. And when we have a serious problem in terms of, are we criticizing the Jewish people, or are we criticizing Israel as a government? And can we criticize other governments openly and not target Israel all the time and saying, BDS is about all governments, when really it really just seems to be about Israel, and almost always ending up there, even though there's always a meandering away from it. This is where it ends up. So IRA helps us in that way. And as noted, even if a definition is adopted by a university, or many definitions about hate or school boards, they really do need to be updated constantly, within every 2 years at least, revisiting them to make sure they still are good guideposts.
Okay, let's switch gears a little bit, and perhaps speak about this intersection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, in the sense of the overlap between them. And we do have a question here about, Rob, your Venn diagram, where you show that there's anti-Semitism on one side, that circle, a circle of anti-Zionism, and there is a small area, at least in your diagram, where they overlap. And I guess the question was, is that really such a small overlap or not? And I think, Jonathan, you too also addressed that through your statistical survey. And I know in one of the articles whose authors are not here today, in Bob Brim and Rhonda Lenton's article, they also addressed the relatively small overlap between clear cases of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism being one and the same. So I don't know whether you want to address that at all.
Yes, please. I mean, this came out of my research. I love Venn diagrams, and they're good tools for demonstrating, what could be happening, and really from trying to encapsulate what students saw. You can criticize Israel, and you can be somebody who says, okay, Israel's this, that, and the other thing based on facts and ideology. And you can have people that are, clearly anti-Semitic without touching on Israel. But the students were usually talking about what Wistrich called the new anti-Semitism, when really it's not only about Israel, but it's about Jews specifically. Canards like, what country are you really loyal to? And then, if you're Jewish, you should be defending Israel, which is not necessarily the case. So, it was the students looking at it from the point of view of their fellow students, faculty, and even, administrators, and understanding where they could have an open discussion, even, outside the classroom, at tables when they're tabling and they're talking to different students. And when, things would basically become really about Jews and Israel, and about, attacking the Jewish state based on connecting Jews to Israel. So, and they talked about that whole kind of spectrum of legitimate criticism of a country, clear-cut anti-Semitism that may not have anything to do with Israel, but more and more what seems to be coming out on campus, and being the elephant in the room, is this kind of new anti-Semitism, where students are silenced, where the campus climate is chilled, and where there can't be clear freedom of speech, and where they really wanted to discuss these issues. They hate the anti-Semitism, not wanting to be shielded from it, but recognizing that it did happen. Not always, but it did happen very clearly. And there wasn't that open dialogue that they really wanted to discuss these things. So it's really that intersection between the two that was important for them. So I'm not sure if I answered anybody's question, but this is really where most of that did come from.
Okay. I mean, I would add, I'm also a fan of Venn diagrams. I didn't present them in my presentation, but they're actually in the original report. And And what they show empirically from our work is that it's entirely possible to hold anti-Jewish views without holding any anti-Israel views. It's entirely possible to hold anti-Israel views without holding any anti-Jewish views. And there's an overlap, and there are people who hold both. So I don't think you can assume that people expressing strong anti-Israel ideas are necessarily anti-Jewish in some way, and vice versa. But they correlate to some degree, and there is certainly a relationship. I think the other thing that kind of complicates it, and we also talk about this in our study, we talk about we use the phrase the elastic view of both anti-Jewish sentiment and anti-Israel sentiment, which is, when you test, when you ask people whether they agree or disagree with multiple statements, you have people who agree with all of them and people who agree with none of them, but then you've got a whole group of people who agree with some while disagreeing with others. So is somebody who expresses, one or two anti-Jewish or anti-Israel ideas while disagreeing with all the others as anti-Jewish or anti-Israel, or how do you deal with kind of different levels? So it's I think empirically what we found is it's very complicated, right? Because you've got different levels of anti-Jewish and anti-Israel sentiment. There are some people who are clearly ideologically anti-Semitic or ideologically anti-Israel in a very difficult, challenging, and difficult to argue that it's not a kind of a blatantly racist view, blatantly racist way. And then you've got other people who, may have picked up some, anti-Israel sentiment or anti-Jewish sentiment, in the course of their lives and are actually pretty unlikely to express it, but nevertheless, perhaps hold some kind of mild dislike, which is different. So there are all sorts of shades of opinion, and depending on kind of what the degree of someone's kind of antagonism, either to Jews or towards Israel, you get the Venn diagrams look different. The amount of overlap, or the amount that people are able to separate these things out, looks different. But critically, I guess the key point is, it is possible to be anti-Jewish without being anti-Israel. It's possible to be anti-Israel without being anti-Jewish, but they also, in pretty well every case that we saw, in fact, in every case that we saw, they correlate to some degree. Correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, but there's a relationship there.
Yeah. Again, changing gears just a bit, but staying on university campuses. Certainly, as we're all aware, modern theories of intersectionality play an important role in campus ideology and planning and university administrative thought. Many have opened up offices that are, depending on which country you happen to be in, referred to as EDI, so equity, diversity, inclusion, or DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or as Jordan Peterson, formerly of the University of Toronto, referred to it DIE, so DIE, diversity, inclusion, equity, somewhat flippantly, I'm afraid, which are offices and ways to promote marginalized groups and care for them. And yet we find that Jewish concerns very often are not addressed by these offices or are not taken seriously by these offices. Certainly that is background, I think, Rob, to your investigations. And Carrie, I'm sure you as a former faculty member, I guess now, at a major American institution, also have come across these types of issues. So do you have any advice, suggestions, observations about intersectionality, EDI or DEI offices and spaces, and how universities deal with such issues, particularly vis-a-vis their Jewish student populations?
I hate to be the one that ventures in because it is a very muddy and muddled area, and often not always handled well at various campuses. I mean, even around something like Holocaust Awareness Week, there are some campuses in Canada that will bring on a boxcar onto campus and have that there, and people would appreciate the educative value of that. In other campuses, it may not happen. And when we look at administrations, it usually is about having that kind of leadership. And sometimes it's from the top down, sometimes it's from the bottom up. And you do wonder, because when intersectionality is a complicated, term, and I think we have to be very careful with that in terms of understanding that there does need to be recognition of the other, and there does need to be recognition of all types of hate. And often what ends up happening, unfortunately, is that hatred toward Jews is ignored. Some of the students even came out and bluntly said in the interviews, I'm now viewed as white. And this idea that of whiteness, which comes out in other forms of literature and so on, and how these complaints are handled. And I'm now viewed as the oppressor, as opposed to somebody that has a history of discrimination. I mean, these intersectional parts, and then some of the students were talking about the idea that I'm female, I'm a lesbian, and my views have to be considered. So I think with university offices, as I said, having definitions of various types of hate, whether it's about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or other kinds of hate, I think is helpful. But this having a good intersectional understanding that is inclusive enough and doesn't discount complaints, because usually this Jewish students especially would talk about some administrations that were very sensitive and did listen carefully, and the offices were well run, and others that were minimizing, ignoring, and not listening to, and then based on this whole idea that the Jewish community is a monolith, and ignoring the fact that you have the Mizrahim from Jews from the East, you have the Sephardic Jews from North Africa, Spain, and Portugal, and it's a very diverse community from places like India. And if you talk to Indian Jews, they complain constantly that they're ignored. They're not even recognized. Some people say, well, you're Indian. I'm Jewish, they would say. And I think this is where intersectionality does become a problem, because what if you do come in and you do complain? And I interviewed Indian Jews who basically were complaining that they were discounted and they weren't listened to. And they said, well, I'm clearly of color. And sometimes these things get lost in the mix because of sometimes, different views and of intersectionality that are ignored conveniently at the wrong moment. So it was interesting getting through the research and interviewing Jews from various backgrounds, and parents, in Canada being multicultural from various lineages, and then having to deal with these problems and being ignored and minimized. And all of a sudden, she was being erased out of the picture because, of her skin color, oddly enough. And discounted.
Erased by whom?
Well,
by the Jewish side or the administrative side?
The administrative side, unfortunately. And then, and when, she would complain as somebody who you could see as very intersectional, and not being listened to. Even when, there shouldn't have been a question around all those issues, because the Jewish community is often seen as a monolith, and it's a very broad community with Jews from all over the world. And as I said, the Indian example was a very clear one where it was upsetting to hear it, but then you sort of look at intersectionality and you're wondering what is happening there. I mean, not to mention Jewish faculty members who are often ignored, and at times discriminated against, which is not something I could talk about it in terms of my research, but anecdotally bringing it up. But as I said, that one student, that was an interesting case where it really wasn't addressed very well.
Well, when intersectionality was originally proposed as a term by Kimberly Crenshaw, I thought it was a very useful concept. And she used a specific example. She said that Black women could be the victims of two different kinds of discrimination, race discrimination and gender discrimination, and that those two kinds of discrimination, two kinds of identity, intersected and made things significantly worse. And that was a very specific, historically specific model of understanding that I think was very useful. As intersectionality over the last decade especially has evolved, it's become a way of collapsing all injustices in the world into one cluster. And so you lose distinctions, you lose what's specific about discrimination against Native Americans in America or Canada. And you say that discrimination against the nations is just the same as discrimination against Palestinians. And so you deprive these groups of all of the local history and specificity that makes their cases and their histories important. So I think it's that political collapsing of different identities into one universal complaint that's made intersectionality, I think, an obfuscating category rather than a helpful one. But I retain a belief that it started out being helpful, and it started out, I think, being pretty clearly defined.
But does it really throw everyone into the same hopper? Because don't you tally up intersectionality points to see who is most discriminated against on the basis of the theory?
Well, it certainly gets even more misrepresentative when all the categories of identity politics and people's investment in their own identity politics get thrown into the mix. I think that, yes, that makes it even more destructive. And if you compete for victim status, no one can. Competing for victim status is a highly destructive phenomenon. First of all, every population in the world views its own tragedies as central and most important. That's a natural feature of human personality. Turning that into a competition for who merits the true status as victim, I think, is hugely destructive.
I would agree with Carrie. I mean, when I saw Crenshaw's work at first, I thought it was a wonderful beginning and great in terms of scholarship, but it's the practice that becomes problematic. And I'm again, I think, agreeing with him in terms of understanding that it's not a concept that many people know beyond academia. I think in the human rights world, it seems to be there, but it's sometimes not recognized very clearly, not used very well. And sometimes there seems to be, as I said, especially against the Jewish community, and the students complained about this vigorously in terms of, from different backgrounds, and clearly, and sometimes, Jews from African descent and, as I said, other descents in terms of skin color and how they're viewed. I mean, this is the problem with how the Jewish community is viewed. It's usually viewed as Ashkenazi in terms of its roots, when it's clearly not. It's an extremely diverse community. And there's going to be points where you may start minimizing it if you start looking at the majority and really not get at the idea of how diverse it actually is, in terms of understanding that even the Sidurs, that are being read, some are not in English, they're in French because of the Sephardic background, Ladino and Spanish. I mean, it's a very diverse community. If you look at the Greek and Turkish world and Jews there. So this is the misunderstanding, and you do wonder about the practice of intersectionality, and that's always my concern.
Yeah, the piece for me that troubles me is the whole kind of culture of victimhood, and the sort of the battle to see whose victimhood is worse. And I think that kind of the Jewish community suffers from that as well. We actually just published a report a couple of weeks ago looking at the nature of Jewish identity across Europe. It's a big 16,000 people sampled, 12 different countries, and we asked people which aspects of Jewishness are most important to people's identity, including belief in God and peoplehood and sharing festivals with family and giving to charity, etc. And the two things that consistently come out as the most prominent components of people's Jewish identity are remembering the Holocaust and combating anti-Semitism. So we see that this very strong sense, I think, within the Jewish community that our experience of being victims, our experience of persecution really kind of shapes who we are. So we're kind of, I think, in many respects, very much part of that part of that victimhood mentality. But at the same time, I think there's kind of massive. Seems to me there's huge kind of misunderstanding or lack of clarity out there about who Jews are. And just thinking about whiteness, for example, it's fascinating to see, how, you look at attitudes towards Jews on the far right, and clearly Jews are not white. We're not part of the Aryan, the Aryan race. And then you look at kind of attitudes on the far left, and Jews are super white, right? They're as white as can be. So there's huge kind of misunderstandings or kind of lack of understanding about who we are as a people. And I think, as I said, I think we're sort of drawn into this victimhood culture as well, to a certain extent, in a way that's not particularly healthy. I think as Jews, we have to kind of get better at sharing our story and our narrative with the world. And also understanding it from our own perspective, having a better understanding of who we are and what our culture is and what our relationship with Israel is, and why it has legitimacy and where it has legitimacy, and to focus much harder, I think, on telling our own story from a sort of a more positive perspective. I think that would be healthy both internally, but also I think in terms of kind of trying to grapple with some of these issues of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I think it's an important piece of the jigsaw puzzle too.
In other words, deconstructing the lachrymose version of Jewish history.
Yeah. Not completely deconstructing it, because I think it's it's part of our history, it's part of our story. But I think one of the things we have to learn as a Jewish people is how to internalize those parts of our history in a way that doesn't completely overwhelm us and doesn't completely shape and dominate our sense of who we are. You can't deny that piece of our history, but I think we have to be careful about how much it shapes us.
That's interesting that you should talk about victimhood within the context of Jewish identity. Some have argued that the presentation of the Jew as victim is something that is accepted and acceptable outside of a specifically Jewish context, and that part of the reason why an acceptance of Israel or of Zionism is so difficult for many people, both within the Jewish community and outside, is that it inverts the traditional Jewish narrative on its head. It's not the Jew as victim anymore, it's the Jew as agent. So I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts about that. Is that a valid way of viewing the situation? Is this another one of these modern myths?
I think that was part of the Zionist revolution. It was to turn a kind of self-understanding of Jewishness on its head and say, we are no longer willing to be victims. We're no longer willing to see ourselves in that way, and we're going to take control of our own destiny. And that's very much part of what Zionism was about, to Israel was about. So it's and in all sorts of interesting ways, I think the kind of the wider Jewish world has benefited from that. You kind of, there's a, the creation of Jewish studies university departments around the world is, in a sense, a kind of a reflection of us sort of taking control of our own story and having a greater sense of confidence in who we are. And I think you see that in all sorts of different ways. Yes, I mean, that was part of what Israel was about, and I guess the challenge, and you see it, I think, quite clearly in Jewish tradition, is how to whereas I think the Zionism was very much a reaction against that sense of Jews being a victim, and wanting to control our own sense of destiny. I think the challenge today is how does one effectively balance those two notions, that we have, in many respects, a terrible, troubling, difficult history. But on the other hand, we have, we've created an extraordinarily rich and vibrant culture and tradition. So how do you effectively kind of balance those two ideas? And actually, for me, the kind of the moment in the Jewish year that captures it so perfectly is that point in the Passover Seder when we open the door, and on the one hand, the kind of the liturgy says at that point, Shvocha Matcha, you should pour out your wrath against the nations of the world for their hatred and discrimination. But on the other hand, we're opening the door and saying, let all who are hungry come and eat. And that tension between, on the one hand being persecuted, but on the other hand wanting to, be part of the world and open ourselves up, is, I think, one of the great challenges of being Jewish. I think we have to kind of grapple more with how do we more effectively balance those two components of Jewishness, both of which, I think are very much part of our tradition.
It's a huge conceptual challenge to try to figure out how to negotiate the relationship between victimhood and agency. And in a lot of political representation of victimized populations, they become exclusively victims and they lose all agency. One obliterates what sense of the development of a unique culture they may have had. So there's a huge historical obfuscation in exclusively treating a discriminated group as victims, but deciding how to negotiate the relationship between their cultural accomplishments and their victim status. I think there's no easy solution to it, except to recognize that if you only do one without the other, you've erased the historical reality. And it's not just about Jews. As I said, it's about Native Americans, it's about Palestinians. All over the world, groups that can be victimized get their actual cultural identities obliterated by that emphasis on their victimhood, which is real. The victimhood is real, but you have to combine a sense of what their agency is, how they've created cultural realities, and how they've understood and represented themselves to provide the complexity that's necessary. But it's not easy.
I started off my chapter in the book talking about my past research on French Jews and looking at them leaving France and coming to, more specifically, Montreal, but spreading throughout Canada after that as an ongoing diaspora, and a very modern one, considering all the things that have been happening in France. I mean, if we're trying to balance out the idea of agency versus victimhood, and looking at Europe specifically, but France as a microcosm, and what's happening there, and then even shifting it back just to muddle things to Israel. I mean, you're always trying to balance it out. Can you ignore the canards that the Jews are only agents of destruction in terms of what Zionism has become, but then you look at France and you see the Jews leaving France, and interestingly enough, talking to them and interviewing them, they're a very well-educated, well-heeled group that left. these weren't, the Jews that were struggling, but ones that think, I've got to leave for other reasons. But looking at that research, you wonder, and how they shifted ideologically, some proudly participating in the 1968, protests in France, and now would never identify themselves, with the left, and they don't see the left as having that kind of legitimacy or agency because of the way it's turned on Israel. And then if you shift back to Israel, it's an interesting, again, microcosm of some in Israel not recognizing the state of Israel and being dead set against it. And we always forget about the fact, again, that even the creation of the Jewish state is controversial. The party system is extremely fragmented, and there's so many opinions, and there's so many parties with specific agendas, maybe ranging from ultra-Orthodox to other, sides of the spectrum. I'll leave it open to interpretation, that we forget that there is an agency. In other words, in France, an agency we have to leave. This is not a safe place for us anymore, even though it was post-1945. And, if you, even with some of those who did leave, in terms of that. So I don't want to digress too much from my own research, and looking at past research, but that's what got me to sort of consider this sort of new anti-Semitism. And that's what they complained about, being blamed for whatever happened in Israel, we would get blamed for. And these were Sephardic Jews mainly that came from Algeria and Morocco to France as a safe haven, and now having to leave. And it was usually their grandparents who left, because they were citizens of France and they could. And then, comparing it to what's happening on campus, very different. But the anti-Semitism and that kind of new anti-Semitism didn't seem that different to me in terms of, being connected. If you're a Jew, you were connected to Israel, and a canard in many ways, because not all Jews are supportive of Israel, but trying to understand, that kind of tension between agency and victimhood. It's an ongoing narrative. I don't think it's ever going to, shift, or, I don't think we can revise it in terms of the revisionist history. The history is what it is. It can't be ignored, but it's what we do, in terms of the future. And in academia, how we help in terms of our students understanding these things and discussing these things openly. And I think this is where there is that point of agency, making sure that students are well prepared when they go out into the world, maybe as doctors, lawyers, as other professionals, or working in a position. How well do we prepare them as agents of change, as, not necessarily understanding their past, which did involve victimhood, but how do you adjust the future if they're future politicians and so on? And I think really, from that pedagogical point of view, there has to be that kind of shift. And we can't just decide that, well, we're just going to throw our hands up in the air. I mean, this is where I agree with Ken Stern's work in terms of understanding these things, but what's going to be for the future, and, the students basically defining that.
Let me follow up on a couple of things here. Rob, you just spoke about left and right. Jonathan, in your presentation, you also gave us statistics about the left side and the right side of the political spectrum. And certainly within the context of a university setting, Jewish students and faculty members would be more worried about anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic or anti-Zionist sentiments coming from the left side of the political spectrum, because that's the world we happen to live in. Whereas, Jonathan, your work seems to indicate that the right side harbors more anti-Semitic and I think, if I remember correctly, slightly more anti-Zionist thought, or am I getting a bit confused there? At any rate, someone posed the question, and a couple of people did did obliquely touch on the subject. This question, for instance, that the evangelical Christian right seems to be religiously anti-Semitic, but pro-Israel at the same time. So we're dealing here with a lot of different contradictions. Any thoughts about left versus right, anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism in terms of these overarching political categories in the modern world?
I wouldn't mind hearing from Kerry, because I remember that as a very distinct part of his chapter that I enjoyed quite a bit.
Well, I think one of the issues is in what social and cultural domain does left versus right anti-Semitism have significant prominence? In other words, where does it count in the world? At this point in the US Congress, it's left anti-Semitism that has a more dynamic, influential role. In the kind of broad domain of hate speech on the internet and in social media, it's right anti-Semitism that I think is most pernicious. And there are quite a few people, including the Community Security Trust in London, that have studied anti-Semitism in media, Facebook, and so forth. And there, I think it's really the flood of anti-Semitic images and claims from the right. A lot of it, by the way, even when it appears on international sites, a lot of it comes from the US of A. Alas, that's one of the discoveries, is that there are a lot of American hate mongers out there working very hard at their jobs. And they may appear on a foreign site, but actually the source is here, which is one of the problems with American free speech, that doesn't have any kind of limits or any kind of adjudication when it enters the public domain. So I think there's a real distinction to be made when you want to look at the relative importance of right-wing or left-wing hate speech, to look at the context, to look at the cultural or political area in which it's operating, and one or the other may really be dominant, and the other may be left or right, may be almost irrelevant. On campuses, both in the US and Canada, it's left anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that matters. I mean, there's precious little right-wing anti-Semitism that has much of a campus presence. So I think that's the first distinction, because I think it's very difficult to generalize across all cultural and political areas. But in terms of what worries me most, I think, is the right-wing anti-Semitism on the media, because that's what's provoking violence most readily. And it's violence that is so horrifically destructive. And the murders of Jews in synagogues, those events just stay with you for the rest of your life. They shape your identity, your community identity. They're really coming from the right, not the left. And I think that's where I think government intervention is really necessary, is toward anti-Semitism that's linked to violence. That's what I think I worry about, and which I think the United States needs to do a lot more than it's presently doing about monitoring the far right and the dangers that it does. I mean, Canada has some hate speech regulation that at least limits what the amount of hate that can be disseminated in the public sphere, and all of the European democracies have versions of hate speech regulation. Britain does, other European democracies do. They try to keep the public sphere from becoming completely venomous and homicidal. In the US, we think it's great to be venomous and homicidal, but I think we're starting to show that there's a real price to pay from that kind of really wholly unmediated public expression.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add that yeah, it's clear, and we actually explore this in the same study, about the relationship between attitudes and violent tendencies. And it's clear that those on the right are more likely to act violently than those on the left. On the other hand, the far left is in British society anyway, is a bigger slice of the population than the far right. So, you know, so there are sort of two things happening simultaneously, and they both require attention. You know, on the right, you've got a largely, in Britain anyway, and I think this is a difference, I guess, with America, is that the far right has largely been destroyed by just kind of public sentiment, and I think it's very much kind of a reaction to Second World War. That, you know, far right fascist views are just completely, you know, untenable in this country. So the proportion of people who actually self-identify as far right here anyway is pretty small. The proportion of people who identify as far left is much larger. So when you're thinking about, like, you know, where is violence likely to come from? It's going to be from, you know, in terms of the political spectrum, from the far right more than the far left. What you get from the far left, though, I think, is this sense of you know, just ongoing apprehension, concern, anxiety, sometimes what feels like harassment, that can also be very unpleasant. And the third piece of the jigsaw puzzle, I think, is when thinking about violence, is the sort of Islamist extremism, which we've certainly seen, you know, several cases of, murderous cases of, in Europe. Which is a kind of another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And, you know, that's a very small part of the Muslim population, but nevertheless, you know, the Muslim population here and elsewhere across Europe is growing. So I think, you know, one of the things that we're kind of conscious of keeping an eye on is, to what extent is the growth of that population also accompanied by a growth of that kind of extremist tendency? Or, you know, does living in Western society have a sort of a moderating effect on the particularly on the Muslim population over time, so that actually, you know, levels of violence decline over time. So it's again, I think, a sort of a complex picture. I'm not sure whether, you know, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism or Islamist anti-Semitism, I'm not sure whether any one of them is more or less important than the other. We need to keep an eye on all of them and monitor all of them. All of them can be destructive in their own ways. I think there's I'm conscious of time, because I know we're about to run out of time, but I would just highlight very briefly the work of Jonathan Haidt, who's a moral philosopher at NYU, who I think has done some really, really interesting work on trying to understand where the left and the right get their moral authority from. And he talks about 5 different sort of pillars, if you like, of moral authority. And in brief, I'm not going to be able to explain this properly in the time that we have left, but in brief, what he finds from his research, and he's done research all over the world, is that those on the left tend to focus on just 2 moral pillars, which are, on the one hand, not doing harm to others, caring for others, and on the other hand, the pursuit of justice. And when you look at Israel through those 2 lenses alone, like do not do harm to minority populations, pursue justice, it's very difficult to look at Israel and be sympathetic towards it. Whereas what he finds is that when you look at people who tend to be on the right of the political spectrum, and actually people who kind of live outside of the Western world, they're not just using those 2 moral pillars, they're also using 3 other moral lenses, I guess, to think about it. One is about loyalty, loyalty to country, loyalty to tribe. Another is about authority and respect for authority. and another is about sanctity and how like certain ideas are sacred. And I think the moment you start to think about Israel as a Jew through those moral lenses, having a sense of loyalty to people, having a sense of respect for Jewish history and for the Jewish story and for the state, and having a kind of, a sense of sanctity for what the land represents, your moral lens, the way you look at Israel morally, changes very significantly. And I think part of what's going on politically is this is where I think he's really, really sharp, is that the left tends to look at Israel through those two moral lenses alone, whereas I think sort of Jews who are supporters of Israel are using all five of those sort of moral dimensions. So there's a piece there. I don't know whether I'm articulating it clearly enough here and there, but I do think the kind of the political left and the political right look at Israel and see it in different ways and bring different moral ideas to their assessment of what's going on.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I was hoping to be able to give everyone a chance for some final thoughts. I get the impression we could continue this discussion for hours, but that would be trying everyone's patience in the era of Zoom fatigue. So let me just close this session by thanking our panelists, Carrie Nelson, Jonathan Boyd, and Rob Kennedy, thanking everyone who worked behind the scenes, and most of all, thanking all of you who attended today and posed questions. We didn't answer that many of them directly, but I hope that we addressed most of the issues in at least an oblique manner. And wherever you may be, I wish you all a good night, a good morning, a good afternoon, and thank you so much for attending this session. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.